This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covell. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today, one of my favorite people on this planet, and one of my most popular guests, if not the most popular guest on my podcast since 2012. Charles Faulkner, my guest today, after a few-year absence, is back, ready to blow our minds. Now, for those of you that have not yet followed Charles' career, please go back and look at my special episode 500. I believe it's about 4 hours. This is a combo episode of all of Charles's prior appearances up until episode 500, condensed into one mega episode. But today, after a long hiatus, we are both back. At least Charles is back, and I'm back to lead him along on a journey. It's pretty easy with Charles because I just have to listen and give some pointers here or there and say, this is interesting to me. And Charles then educates me to things that I was not aware of. This is the process. It's been happening for years. I quite enjoy it. I hope you enjoy it too. And I hope you enjoy this conversation with Charles Faulkner. Here's something that's really chewing on me. And I know you've done this great presentation, this TED Talk that everyone should check out. But I've been thinking a lot recently about this crypto space. I mean, look, you're a guy in decision-making, psychology, investments. You've been there for a long time. You're a great observer, a great educator. And I'm looking at this crypto space, right? And I'm seeing these interesting things happen generationally, right? So Warren Buffett has come out and said, I don't know how or when it will end, but it will end terribly. So from an imagination standpoint, based on all the experience he has, he doesn't seem to see it. Now, Charles, I have many young friends in their 20s and 30s that have made millions of dollars off crypto. They are living and breathing and eating it, and they can't figure out why somebody like Buffett can't see it, because in their imagination, they see it crystal clear. So there's these two movies going on with this interesting new subject. Now, of course, you could go back in time and pick other subjects where there was two movies going on, maybe 3 movies or 4 movies. What's your perspective on that when you hear that, though? You got one of the greatest investors ever looking at this fascinating new space saying, no way, and then all these young people making a ton of money saying, yes way.
Well, I'm reminded of a remark by Jim Rogers that I actually bought into when I initially heard it. He said that, Jim Rogers' voice, 90% of all options, long options, expire worthless. Hence, options were not worth looking at. And it was that leap which Taleb Nassim called him out on. Yeah, okay, they do. And in fact, Microsoft made a ton of money by taking bets that their stock would go down, taking bets against people who thought their stock would go down. Of course, it didn't. So those people that actually didn't understand what options were and where they functioned in that space, like Rogers, at that time anyway, didn't see it as the opportunity that people like Nassim obviously did and profited from. So yeah, they're so interesting that this is the idea that reality is more complex. Well, that quote is not only stranger than we think, it's stranger than we can think. And that it has these multiple dimensions to it. Those that can begin to see some of, because you can never see all of it. You can never actually know reality. But if we can have a way of organizing our perceptions, this is the imagination, such that we get something more of it than Buffett does from his point of view. Buffett, he deals in real things. Keep in mind, this is a really important point for any investor, any trader, is that the line from Buffett is that when dumb money knows it's dumb, it's not dumb anymore. It becomes smart. Well, what's the difference between dumb money and smart money? So in Buffett's case, he never invested according to himself, and I haven't looked at the Berkshire Hathaway's portfolio recently, but I know for years, did not invest in tech. Now, we know huge fortunes in our time. You know, who are some of the leading people in terms of wealth and changing our world have been in tech. And Buffett and Munger, because Munger was in there as well, very, very bright guy, didn't invest in tech because he said, I don't understand it. Now, that's actually pretty smart to not get into something where you go, oh, let's all rush into this because other people are rushing into it. There's a step there, though, from not understanding it and hence not getting involved in it to, oh, this is going to end badly, where now you stepped over from, okay, I don't know about it and hence I'm not going to try to make that investment strategy, which is smart, to I don't know about it, but things I don't know about end badly. Well, now you've, as you just pointed out, you painted a picture, you painted a mental movie. Now, is he wrong? Of course not. It is going to end badly. It's going to end badly the way any pouring into a market does. And Brian Arthur of Santa Fe Institute, and this goes into my ideas around complexity, well, not my ideas, but the ideas around complexity, is that when the automobile industry started, and my exact numbers are going to be off, but it was nearly 400 auto companies in the United States at the initial beginnings of automobiles. People were building automobiles in their garage, literally, like the internet happened. And then there were so many players, if you will, so many participants in the market. And then there was this great washout in the market. And after that, there were very fewer of them. And Dodge joined Fisher, and Fisher joined General Motors, and they got together, and we have then an auto industry emerging in the 20s and 30s in the United States. Same thing happened with color televisions. Lots of participants poured into that, and then there was the washing out, if you will, the market collapse of that, and the few players that stayed in began to build from that. And of course, 2001, there were all these different people going into that big next gold rush, the internet. Out the other side of that, we got Cisco, we got Amazon, we got all these other companies that stayed in that and became major players in that. So, of course, the same thing's going to happen in crypto. I can say that right now. But that doesn't mean it's not going to be some huge thing coming up. And I was actually just looking at blockchain yesterday in terms of a technology and the way it's being applied and reapplied. And I'm going, yes, it is going to be a big deal.
You're giving this nice 360-degree perspective. You're painting why Buffett could say what he does. You're painting why crypto could absolutely be changing the future. What's interesting is to watch the different sides. And there's this, I think it was a Nirvana song called Territorial Pissings. So excuse my bad language, but it kind of sounds like that instead of Mr. Buffett being a little more open-minded and saying, yeah, a lot of this stuff won't work out, but my gosh, I kind of missed the .com thing. And some of these are going to be titans. I'm just not familiar with it. He doesn't go that way.
No, and he doesn't have to, come on. He's not only near the end of his career.
He doesn't have to, of course.
And what's interesting is that this idea of working with what you know is that he's always been into tangibles. He buys a railroad. I mean, come on.
Things that we can see, touch, taste, eat.
Right. And that has worked with him so well. It's like, he doesn't need to rush into this. And he's entirely right as the pundit, as the grand seer for the average guy in the street who thinks he's going to now jump into some sub-new spin-off of another pretender to Bitcoin, participate in this, and get wealthy. Well, that's a matter of timing. We are like back when I remember in Chicago, we had all these day trading places set up down in the Loop, where guys could come in and grab a computer terminal for the day and day trade stocks. And yeah, fortunes were made, and yeah, fortunes were lost because people were just playing that. They weren't. If you take some guy from it doesn't even exist anymore, from the CBOT, who's a floor trader, he could get on one of those terminals right now in the cryptocurrency, make a bundle. Probably are doing that. Speaking to the guys off the street, when the music stops and there aren't as many chairs, for the guy in the street, Buffett's right. But then on the other side of this, and as I said, I was just looking at it yesterday, where you've got the young Russian kid, 23 years old, and behind Ether, and the idea not only using blockchain for currency, but using blockchain to store scientific discoveries and other data and so forth. A whole new world's opening up.
I had a young guy explain it to me. This is kind of a side tangent. A young guy explained it to me where I kind of had a little bit more of a light bulb moment. And he said, it's kind of, remember the old Second Life, the second world, where people would have their alternate persona on some video game?
Yeah. He
said a lot of it's like that. And you kind of have to put yourself in that headspace. And this is almost like a second world being created.
Well, this goes to one of my favorite authors in the sci-fi space, William Gibson, who coined the word cyberspace in his book Neuromancer, which is still worth reading. It is this alternative world. Different powers and forces and individuals in the real world occupy spaces in this virtual world, but they're not exactly the same. There's this rebalancing of power, this rebalancing of knowledge that in this other world, things are similar to our world, and yet to accept that similarity as real is to not see the advantages of how different it is. I mean, the idea of using blockchain to record and verify scientific research, it's like, that's a headspace leap.
In your word, it's pure imagination to dream that up. It's brilliance.
And this is, they talk about, what makes humans, and there's another David Attenborough series started, the Planet Earth 2 is going, and we're finding out that octopus are really smart, but we're also finding out that fish use tools. It's like, okay, you're blowing my mind now. And it's like, what makes humans distinctly different from other creatures on this planet? And it's not that we're tool makers, and it's not that we have language, although we have language in a really different way than other creatures. It's that we have imagination.
Speak to the differences in imagination, because you say that, and it's a big picture point, but there's a lot of factors that go into imagination. As I bring up this example with cryptos, and it really wasn't to pen a negative view on Buffett, but it was to show the different ways that people are imagining the future. But you have many things going on here. You have the cultural, you have the whatever your experience is, and you actually have the way our minds work. So it gets to be quite a complicated little conundrum to decipher, huh?
Well, I would say complex. I would say that to use language that I would use, iterative and recursive, is that what we do with our bodies, if you will, is we have interactions with the world, and then these become the basis of our imagined actions. Like, to give you a specific idea, you go down the block to the store, or you drive somewhere for something, and you're getting from here to there, and you maneuver, and maybe there's some sort of block in the way, some road is closed or something, and you make your way around it and so forth. And then in our imagination, when we think about a goal, we think about some life achievement we want to make, we think about getting to there, we think about what obstacles are in the way, we think about how we're going to navigate those obstacles, and we utilize the world as we know it as the basis of our imagination.
But our ability to see accurately, I mean, that starts to...
Well, now that's what I'm getting at, is that then, so that's sort of the copying, that's fundamental to human behavior. It's been noted by all sorts of scientists in various fields now that, one of the principal ways of human beings getting along in the world is we just copy other people. We go, well, Mikey likes it. I'll try it.
And hey, listen, I'm old enough to remember with a name like Michael, I had to hear that damn cereal commercial quite a bit.
That's right. And that's like really basic to human beings. Now, the thing is, though, that you can do that here to there. A goal is a mental location in space, and one is moving towards it. This is basic cognitive linguistics, and other fields have explored this. Then you can also go, well, then, if it's over there, what if I folded space and I could actually bring it mentally closer? I can't do that in the real world, but I can do that in imagination. And now we're into Einsteinian kind of ideas, that you fold space, and you've got warp drives and hyperdrives, and all the science fiction imagination is based on that idea. So what started out was with making something identical to the world outside us in our inner world, we begin to manipulate it and change it. And as I say, that in this cyberspace that William Gibson describes, and the one we really have, is that, yes, there are, of course, the military has their big cyber thing and cyber wars and all that, and corporations have their big spaces. And new possibilities not imagined, not even possible in our physical world, become possible in this world of imagination, especially when you've created it in such a way that it's shared by everyone, or most everyone. People operate there, like cryptocurrencies, as an example, and just one of many, many.
Break this down a little bit more in terms of our ability to observe, because we're going somewhere in this as we start to lay some of this foundation. We're going to move down a certain path. So I'm just a guy. I can look around the room. I can make certain observations. I think that I'm seeing a laptop in front of me. I think that I'm seeing certain things around the room. But I can't know for sure, and I don't know necessarily if I'm seeing everything. And so one of the interesting things that takes place in the mind, and I want you to run with this, is we see one set of data, and for the things that we don't see, we fill in the blanks in a kind of creative way. Speak to that.
It's well understood now that we see what we've seen before. And not in my words, but in words of other authors that have come before me, is that language, the language we inherited from our ancestors, is identifying aspects of our experience, our so-called reality, saying, pay attention to this. This helped us survive. This helped us thrive. And so we have these words to name things and processes and so forth of our experience and our mentor experience, our ideas, that will help us flourish. It's hard for people to wrap their head around the idea that since the time of Shakespeare, who coined at least 150 words himself, new words, is that by many estimates, language has multiplied by a factor of 5. That is 500% increase in the number of words since the time of Shakespeare. That is more words to identify more bits of our experience that it might be worth paying attention to. Of course, what happens with this is a splintering. We're just talking about the people who are in the cryptocurrency and the blockchain and so forth space and have all that language for that. Guys of Buffett's generation who've done very well, thank you, who don't know those words, understand those words, and so cannot actually identify the things that the people who, the young guys and gals are identifying in this new cyber world.
It's fascinating. Two different groups of people that both speak English, and they can't communicate because they have an entirely different language.
We're getting closer to my current interest in this, in as much as that is what's going on, is that people use words and we assume the other person knows what we mean. This is, in psychology, this is known as naive. It's part of what's known as naive realism. And naive realism is that what I'm seeing in the world is real, and what I say about the world is real, and that words really refer to real things in the world. And I know a lot of the listeners right now are going, well, of course they do. What else would it be? And in fact, we're now realizing, or shouldn't say now realizing, this has been known in psychology for more than 100 years, is that that's not the case. That we put a name on a process, and we can know that in some cases, like making one's coffee. And okay, so coffee's a word that not only refers to the beans, it refers to let's get coffee. Is there any coffee around here? There's got, and so on. Is that one word actually has multiple related meanings. But people don't think of it that way. They think of things as being when they think of the word, they think of it having a very specific meaning. This leap, if you will, of imagination allows us to get through the world. We say, my car is around here somewhere. And we use this generic word car, but we put that little word my in front of it. And in our mind, we know exactly what that car looks like. And I'm thinking, oh yeah, I know what that car looks like too. Except that you sold your old car and bought a new one since I last saw you. So I don't know what your new car looks like, but I don't know that. But those slippages, they didn't used to matter when humans lived in the same place most of their life, which it's incredible to think about, but it was only a few hundred years ago that was often the case, that it was people who left where they were from were unusual. People that came from somewhere else were completely untrustworthy. And now it seems normal to us to get on airplanes and fly, tens of thousands of miles and meet people we've never met before and so forth. But that's actually fairly new. And our brains didn't evolve in that environment. Our brains evolved in environments where everything was pretty much the same. We knew the same people and things were what they were. And so this naming that we do, this understanding reality that we do as being stable and permanent and always true, that's our default by evolution. And now we're in a world that's changing daily, weekly. Our brains aren't designed. Design is not what it is. Our brains didn't evolve to deal with that.
Yeah, what you're really throwing out is so fascinating, because you're really saying, hey, let's have a conversation and question the words that we use, question what they mean, question the language. Is the language that we're using even applicable in some conversations? Are we using words that we think we're describing in a certain phenomena to somebody, but it's really not accurate, and it creates a whole sort of issues. Just the other day when I had this conversation with a young guy in his 30s, where I was getting in deep, trying to pull from him some great crypto insights, and I just felt myself reaching for words and words and words, and he kept giving me words back that weren't connecting. And I was just trying to find something where we could at least get on the same page, and it was a challenge.
Yeah, and for our listeners, it's not the words per se; it's the word and the concept and the meaning that it has. It could be a doodle on a page. The point is that the word points at an idea, a concept that we can then use to make meaning of what we're experiencing. When we don't have ways to make sense of that, of course, we develop new language. And you and I both know, having grown up with the internet, is that there are all sorts of people who are younger than us have jobs that they were like science fiction out of Star Trek, the original, with William Shatner kind of names for made up things that couldn't possibly be real. Webmaster, come on.
It's a real interesting challenge, because as you were just talking, I was giving you that example, and you pointed out, you said, Mike, it's not just the words, it's the meaning, it's what goes behind them. And that's exactly what I was thinking about, even though I didn't describe it to you that way. And what it became as I was listening to him, I was like, my gosh, this one word, this one phrase he's giving me was a white paper. It wasn't just one word. It was a whole
That's what I was getting at before.
Conceptual
you
framework.
say the word coffee, and it has whoosh, all these multiple connected meanings. People go, yeah, come on, we're using a word like that. But you use a word like crypto, and that also has whoosh, all these different associations and meanings. And people go, oh, yeah, I understand. Whereas, as you were pointing out earlier, something that I talked about in my TED Talk, is we get some little bit of experience, and our imagination fills in the rest with what we expect to be there, with what we're familiar with. And that's both the wonder of the imagination and the danger as a trader and as an investor, is that we'll hear something or see something and fill in all sorts of stuff that we really ought to have taken a little more time, to see whether that's the fill-in that works in that situation or not.
Yeah, you just make the point right there, which is we lay this 10, 15 minutes of foundation to get to that point, which is, with all of this complexity in our daily lives, with language that means different things to different people, it's a real challenge to make good decisions in the face of uncertainty, because by definition, what you've been explaining so far to the audience is just uncertainty. I mean, we can't be certain about not very much. I mean, so far the sun seems to work pretty consistent, but there's not a lot of certainty these days, or if there ever has been.
Well, I think that's really an interesting point. I think that, and I'm going way broad brush here, that uncertainty used to be historically something human beings expected to have to deal with. Historically, it was dealt with by ritual and by divination. And I'm being serious about that you didn't know what the world had to throw at you, and so your religion, your Stoic philosophy or whatever would orient you to certain ways of interacting with the world, so that whatever the world did, you could still be centered in yourself. You go, okay, the world's uncertain, but I'm going to respond in this way, either out of faith or out of reason, whatever it was. And then the other side of that being divination. That is like, okay, I want to try and figure out what the world wants, what my God wants, what the spirits want, and tried in some way to do something to connect with that so-called randomness. You've got the throwing of bones or the I Ching. All these things we're trying to say, well, if I take some random phenomena and I toss it into the world like some coins, that those coins are not going to land randomly. They're going to land based on all the elements and everything that's going on around me. And if I know how to read that, then I'll know a little bit more about what subtly is affecting the world the way it is. Now, I went down this rabbit hole for a reason, because that's very often what forecasting is in markets. It's based out of that same deep, imaginative, ancestral desire to try and make sense of the world. And it's trying to somehow connect with the complexity of patterns that's going on. And the danger, of course, is that when the coins land, or when the number comes up on the VAR or whatever it is, it's solid and it's particular. And so people go, well, that must be true because that one came up at that moment, as opposed to the idea that, yeah, at that moment, that's the way it came up. But in fact, that's now in the past and reality has moved on.
You mentioned this in your TED Talk, the rise of magical thinking. That's where you're going right now, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I'm saying magical thinking never, yeah, exactly. I'm saying first, magical thinking never went away. The example I just gave, which I didn't have time in the mere 18 minutes of my talk to point out that the divination and prediction and forecasting in the modern era are actually deeply related to each other. And boy, I'm like the 400th guy and gal to point that out. There's whole books on that, like Fortune Tellers and other books that point out. It was the 60s, maybe the 40s. It was a government official pointed out that businesses do forecasts in order to convince everybody to actually take action. In other words, the idea of forecasting the future economically wasn't that it was in any way accurate. It was like the shaman coming down from the hill and giving the delivery to the warriors that this was the time to go on the hunt. So they would go on the hunt because the hunt was dangerous and people were going to die, or in the modern terms, people were going to go broke. But if nobody went on the hunt, well, that would be even worse. It was a way of getting people into action, and that these are still with us. That people see a forecast and they go, well, I'll act on that. Whereas if there wasn't a forecast, if I truly told people, if I told people the truth, which is that the system is the best predictor of itself, people go, okay, well, what does that mean? I mean, it means that the system will let you know where the system is going.
It's that sounds a little trend following-esque right there. I was
going to say, that's where I'm going with this. I say, well, and they go, well, what do we do with that, Mr. Wizard? And I'm saying, well, Bogle worked out that that's what you do with that is you invest in everything in the market. Since the market is the best predictor of itself, then buy the market. And of course, now we have passive index investing. And on the other side, yes, exactly, we have trend following. If the market is the best predictor of itself. But people go, that's really unsatisfying. I'd really prefer to know something specific. And I said, okay, so you want the shaman to come down, from the hill, from his, meditation or whatever, and give you something, some definitive thing that's going to hand you. They go, yes, that's what I'd like. I go, well, this is why we still have predictions.
How do you reach that? I mean, you've got a lot of interesting experiences in talking with groups, individuals over the years, and you meet that person that wants the shaman. They want the magical thinking. You just rationally map out kind of our evolutionary thinking. You talk about imagination. You lay out all these pieces to where we have so much trouble dealing with uncertainty, the reasons why. You talk about language. And then they still come back and they said, but Mr. Faulkner, I watched that TV and there's a magic guy on there and he's telling me, sweet nothings, and I want the sweet nothings. And Mr. Faulkner, why do I need to believe you? Why should I believe you? Why can't the magical thinkers possibly be accurate?
Well,
I just made that one up. That was completely off the fly.
Well, the thing is, and this goes into the whole probability problem that Nassim Taleb writes so much about, is incerto, that it's going to be right sometimes. I mean, I point out that one of the fundamental reasoning processes human beings have is reasoning by resemblance. And again, I'm not the originator of this. That we go, that reminds me, that's just like, last week, or Facebook is an internet company. And it has people going to its site. Google's an internet company. People going to its site. I should buy Facebook. And, people should have bought Facebook. It's like reasoning by resemblance isn't wrong. And it's one of our oldest and deepest strategies for making sense of the world. It's just that when it is wrong, it's spectacularly wrong. And the point is, in our modern era, as I said earlier, Gregory, the guy who wrote the book on physics, is that science is an assault on common sense. Another way of saying is that what seems commonsensically right to someone like a Buffett or a Munger and so forth doesn't make sense of the world. The world there was a point, again, and I'm broad brush here, where with technology, we really brought a lot of the world under our control, whether it was, wherever you want to start, whether it was internal heating or internal plumbing. And I'm so glad I live in the age of both. And then we moved on to electricity, and we moved on to different transportation with gasoline engines and so forth, that the world really looked controllable. The thing is that if you get into the area of complexity, is that as we were able to connect up more things, more people, more nodes, if you will, at faster and faster rates, then we actually recreated a complexity that we'd actually thought we'd begun to control about the world, and we recreated it in our human world. So that our human world now is complex, and which is to say multiple agents, multiple connections, multiple transactions happening at high speeds. Feedbacking was in nature and weather, and people would be trying to divinate when to plant the crops and when to harvest the crops and when to go hunting. And now that's become our created world, whether it's cryptocurrency or our current politics.
We were using this word uncertainty. We're talking about all this complexity, which maybe a lot of us think, well, gosh, with so much complexity, we're getting more perfect. We can predict better. We can do all these things, and there's uncertainty is the dinosaur. It's going away, but obviously it's not. So we have all this uncertainty, and uncertainty, as you've been talking about in this conversation so far, it's just a word. It can mean a lot of different things. If you were to try to unpack uncertainty to more of something where people can really wrap their arms around it, how would you begin to, you could probably give an hour-long presentation just talking about unpacking uncertainty to give. I'm going to give you the floor right now then for as long as you want to take, because I'd like to see you unpack it, because it's a great word. And I think sometimes we use it so much that we don't unpack it. And I think you'd be a great guy to kind of, if you want to take a stab at kind of ripping it apart, I'd welcome that.
So I'm gonna go sideways. I'm gonna go sideways on you. I'm gonna back out of the picture and say uncertainty is one quality, one property of complex adaptive systems, or complex systems, if you prefer. And we live now in complex systems. And complex systems, I just said, are interacting multiple agents with intentions, with memory, competing for scarce resources, so if any of this is familiar, in a somewhat unbounded environment, and hence has nonlinear causes and effects. Okay, what does that mean? What we're seeing around the world is what it means, is that some little action taken can have huge ramifications. And, whether you want to look at our financial systems or our political systems, you can pull an example for yourself of that. It also means that in other cases, huge amounts of effort to change things, to, for example, deal with healthcare in America, or the opioid crisis, or the financial system, that huge amounts of effort and money will not make a difference. That's another example that one is in a complex situation. When one gets unintended consequences, another example that one is in a complex situation. There's different ways to go. This is definitely, we are living in complexity. When you break out what are the properties, the qualities of complexity, well, they're ambiguity. That is that there is no definitive point of view or understanding. There's stochastic uncertainty. There's endogenous effects. There's reflexivity. And there's the limited perceptual and information processing limits that we as the decision makers have relative to this system that's much larger and moving in many, many ways that we can't track consciously. Okay, we can't even track it with our technologies. Going back through those. In complexity, in a complex system, the ambiguity, the uncertainty, the endogenous effects, the reflexivity are irreducible, meaning that at a certain point you cannot make them less than they are. By the way, you wouldn't want to make them less than they are. As I've endeavored to explain to some pretty high-level decision makers, is that when markets are falling, they're actually coming out of complexity and coming into order. That is, when you get a price decline, like you get 400 points down in the Dow, that means the markets are now coming into order. In a complex system, it needs to be roiling and boiling. It needs volatility. It is a system that is far from equilibrium. And the problem is that the economic models we use are equilibrium-based models. That we think there's a settle there. We talk about the close, what the price at the close, the price at the open. And with the language, we fail to notice, well, that's an arbitrary point in time. And as soon as that point in time is passed, things have moved on. Reality has moved on. What am I trying to say in all this? I don't know. Are you a dog or a cat person?
Dog.
Okay, we'll use a cat.
I like cats too.
You got a cat. If the cat loses its tail, it's still a cat. If the cat somehow loses an ear, it's still a cat, right? And the point is that the cat can lose certain qualities about it, cat, and it can still have its catness. But at a certain point, it's not a cat anymore, it's dead, Jim. In that way, complex systems are very like living systems. That is that the markets, for example, need to have all these participants making exchanges, transacting, and so forth, or it's not a market. As we know from the credit crisis, when the banks started to not trust each other and wouldn't trade with each other, is that it suddenly wasn't what it was anymore. The equivalent to that was it was dead. It actually needs all that activity. It needs that ambiguity, that uncertainty, that roilingness to be the living system that it is. Think about markets as an ecosystem. Like, I know I'm near Lake Michigan, so I can say like a big lake. And there's the creatures that are on the surface of the water, and there's the creatures that are in the middle levels of the water, and there's things that are bottom feeders, there's things that are near the shore, and so forth. And if you take that system in its totality, it's really too big to wrap one's head around. We have something called, we have an infestation. We have zebra mussels that came in on the boats coming in from China. And the zebra mussels, they came into an ecospace, there wasn't any predator. And so they just multiplied like crazy. And so the docks and locks that we have here are blocked up with these zebra mussels. And they go, well, what can we do about this? We introduce another life form into the lake to try and deal with that. Well, they're thinking about that. But they don't know what that new life form might do that'll change the whole system. Because in an ecosystem, things are not additive. It's not 1 + 1. If you add something new into the system, it doesn't just add a new feature like on your phone. It changes the entire system. That's complexity. In this situation, in the markets, and say cryptocurrency is an example, it isn't just, okay, we have the markets plus cryptocurrency or plus blockchain. The blockchain is beginning to change the way people are thinking of doing transactions in the entire market. Now, you come back to the idea. So there's ambiguity. Warren Buffett, who's a big old whale, for example, we just use that metaphor, whether it's true or not, sees that ocean, that lake, as a big old fish differently than some small insect that floats on the surface of the water. Sees that situation differently than the bass. So there's different perspectives and points of view, and none of them is right. It's right for that point of view, which is what I was trying to say earlier about Warren. Warren's being very smart from his point of view. And he's advising people, don't try to be something you're not. But he didn't preface it that way, to say, look, I'm not saying it's going to end badly. Doesn't mean it doesn't have a great future. Just as I say, the washout in cars and televisions and the internet ended up being huge industries. He was saying, know what you're doing. Now, all of this, of course, is shot through with uncertainty. And I use the technical term stochastic uncertainty. Because it's not just that you're uncertain about the future. It's that you also have false positives, like the idea that you could use reasoning by resemblance to say that, well, I should invest in any internet company that's involved in blockchain, which is happening, or has the word coin in the name. And while that might be a very short strategy of making money, in the longer term, this is not going to work, of course.
A friend of mine sent me a picture today. I think it was called Banana Coin, and it's a coin for organically grown bananas in the country of Laos. So apparently there is now a coin for bananas.
I've heard of this, actually.
It seems like Fonzie's jumping the shark at that point in time.
It does. So there are these false positives where, it seems like a good idea, and ultimately you were misled, or as Talib Nassim would say, is fooled by randomness. But there's also false negatives. And a false negative is, in medical terms, is like you have the disease, but the test said you didn't. And a false negative, kind of thing that people could take from Warren Buffett, not that he meant to say that. But he's saying basically there's no there. And when in fact there's very much a there. It's just not the there that the test was able to detect. And so we humans, because of our desire for what's simple, clear, vivid, and familiar, which is, by the way we make sense of the world, not the way we think we make sense of the world, logic and reason, is that I recognize bananas, I recognize coin. That could be an investment, and maybe it is. The point is, the due diligence, the ability to see beyond that. And then how to see beyond that. What I've been making the case for recently is the more you can understand the nature of complexity, the more you can understand which of the participants, including yourself, in these emerging worlds, are going to be the most fittest. And that fitness as a sense of success.
I think you were wise to take a pivot from my asking about uncertainty and take it to complexity, because complexity is the big picture. As we think about this complex world that you're describing, the question starts to become, what do we do? What do we do with all this complexity? Because trying to be the person that understands every possible variable like there's only so much time in the day. I mean, it's a really difficult issue there. How do you direct people to think about, given that you've spent the time here laying out this foundational complexity, the next step is, what do we do in the face of it all?
Big question is to know when you're in a complex situation and when you're not. To back up all the way to the beginning and to my TED Talk as well, is that our neurology learned to deal with the world in simple ways. As I've called it, reasoning by resemblance. This is like that. The idea of language. So we can say, let's get some coffee. And that is sufficiently detailed enough that you and I could go out into the streets of the city you live in and we could get ourselves some coffee. On that very local level, it works. That is to say, close up in time and space, which is what our neurology evolved to deal with, was close in time and space.
Charles, Mike, coffee, cafe, let's go. Boom.
Yeah, done. And then each of us, so that's we make our way through the world like that. We reading other people, as I say, reading in the sense of looking at them and seeing that somebody has a quizzical look or an unhappy look on their face or a happy look on their face. Looking into a coffee cafe and seeing it's empty and going, well, maybe we won't get coffee there. Maybe it's not that good, or whatever. And then each of us has an area of expertise where we've developed skills, whether it's as a programmer or as an investor or something else. And these are complicated. You're talking about the guys earlier you talked to about cryptocurrency and so forth, and they have their own language about it, a lot of details about it. And so they have a complicated Now, complicated is like, for example, your smartphone. It can have lots and lots and lots of things going on, but it does have predictable causes and effects, like Skype that we're talking over right now. Hugely complicated system, but it produces predictable outcomes. And people have expertise in the hardware and in the software and so forth. And then we get into complexity. Complexity is in the markets. Complexity is in trying to get 5 people in a room to get along with each other in a business or in a family or whatever. Complexity when human beings are involved. We often mistake when we're in a complex situation with when we are in a simple situation. In other words, we just want the human beings to do what they're supposed to do. Why can't they just do what they're supposed to do? In other words, we keep trying to pull a complex situation back into either our framework of complicated. I see this with young entrepreneurs who understand the controlled world inside the box and the screen they write their code on. And then they want the world where they're going to introduce their product to have that same predictability, to have that same regularity. And it doesn't. They're taking one world for the other. Now, here's the key to this, is that there are those simple strategies like let's get coffee done. There are those complicated strategies like here's the way to set up a LAN network or something done. And if you apply those to complexity, then you're suddenly having the unintended consequences, the out of proportion responses, the uncertainty, unpredictability, because you're not using what is congruent with the situation you're in. And that's what happens, I think, a lot, if not all the time, with inexperienced traders and investors. They think they think that the markets are complicated, and if they only had more software or a smarter guy or another indicator that they could then wrap their head around it and predict what was going to happen, they'd know what to do. And the point is that the rules and the actions in the world of complexity are different than they are in the simple or complicated.
Charles, let me give you one to run with. So I think Bitcoin, I don't know where it is today, but it got up to very close to $20,000 per Bitcoin, maybe $19,500. And you could see the enthusiasm level of so many new people who were just probably thinking simple. They weren't thinking this was complex. Why would they think this was complex? They knew friends that had made millions of dollars or $100,000 in just 2017 alone. So going to your credit card and loading up on your credit card or taking a home mortgage loan or whatever to buy Bitcoin at 19,500 per Bitcoin made perfect sense. And I think I would argue, based on how you're presenting, that they were mistakenly thinking simple when it was extremely complex, even though it looked simple. Like, this is a simple way to make a lot of money. This can't go wrong, Mike. There's nothing complex about it.
Again, to quote Warren, I don't mean to, I know I have in previous podcasts as well. He's so quotable. He said that stocks are the only area in life where buying cheap isn't what people do.
But what's really interesting too, this is kind of a side note on the crypto space. You have seen enough to know that in the 70s and perhaps for a good portion of the 80s, a lot of traders, either for themselves or offering products to clients, would shoot for high volatility type returns. They'd have no problem shooting for 20 or 50% in a year, and they might even take a 50% drawdown on a regular basis.
It came out after that whole fiasco that they would go into the room, the money guys would say, if you can't give us that kind of return, you have to promise us that kind of return or we won't do business with you.
Right. So there you go. You've got that in the 70s, 80s. And then I think you got to the 90s and then the 2000s, perhaps even the dot-com crash, there was still a lot of chasing returns. And then we got very conservative where people are saying, well, we don't want any more than, like single digit volatility on an annual basis. I mean, all these things, Nassim Taleb would say, this is just impossible. You're compressing things. It doesn't work like this. That doesn't stop Wall Street from offering it. What's really interesting about the crypto space and the crypto generation is they seem to remind me of the return chasing and being so far more comfortable with that extreme volatility than perhaps the generation or two before them, because Bitcoin's taken multiple 50% drawdowns so far. And so it's an interesting thing right now where people seem to be tolerating this extreme volatility in crypto, whereas they really weren't for the last 20 years since the dot-com bubble. Do you have any observations about that or not?
I do, and I realize that they're very speculative, and so I'm holding my tongue here because
I'm not really asking for that kind of thing for you, but it's something you can just see these different generations with different information, different language. And perhaps, that memory, that market memory is not transferring to a 20-something guy right now today who's excited about a blockchain and Bitcoin.
I think there are certainly guys like that. And then I think there are people that understand this. Let me give you one example from my own work, is that in complexity is not, okay, the word complex system, complex adaptive system, these are terms of art. Okay, fine. But what people don't realize, largely, I don't think, outside of the academic world, is that network theory absolutely overlaps with complexity. That self-organization and learning organizations and Sengi and the fifth discipline overlaps with complexity. Hierarchy theory, which comes out of complex biological thinking, which is what I'm using to design how I think about the markets at this point, all comes out of complexity. Just take one of those for the moment. Network theory is that networks are not just one-to-one connections, that networks develop nodes or hubs, super hubs, some of them call them in language I wish they didn't, that are subject to power laws. Okay, what power laws? It's success to the successful is an example of power laws. That, why is somebody famous? Well, he's well known for his well-knownness. And you get out of proportion responses. In other words, it's not to go back to Nassim Taleb and his work is mediocristan versus extremistan. Mediocristan, as an example, would be the height of human beings. That even the tallest human being is not that much taller than all the rest of human beings. It creates that bell-shaped curve. Whereas if you look at wealth is extremistan. Wealth is a power law, where the people who are wealthiest are multiples of everyone else. And it's this huge curve that starts way high up with the Waltons and the Koch brothers and so forth, and then down to 90% of the rest of us. That power laws are what are operative in complex situations. And so connectedness, being attached to a large node or hub like an Amazon, like a Google and so forth. Now, there's actually mathematics behind this, that if you are an early entrant and then you add members to your network at a certain rate, 2x, that over time you're going to be a major player in that, whether you want to or not. I think anyway, that when Steve, and I know this from actual interviews that they're old videos that I've seen of Steve Jobs, that he described when he went into Xerox PARC and he saw all the Alto graphical user interfaces, computers hooked to each other and hooked to a printer. And he could see at that moment that the network of computers and the printer and the graphical user interface were all going to be huge, because he didn't see 7 computers hooked up to each other. He saw 7,000 or 700,000. But he started out with one computer hooked up to a printer with graphical user interface, and that was the Mac, desktop printing. And that revolutionized that industry and revolutionized Apple. But he also saw the rest of those things happening. I think that Jeff Bezos actually saw and knew about network effects and was saying, what company could I build that the underlying software could sell anything? And so he started out with something that was non-perishable, that there was a built-in market for, and that had all the characteristics of differentiation that he would want to have his software have for any product, and he came in with books. And apparently it is. He took a long time deciding what to sell on the internet, because he knew if he did that and he built that platform and he kept adding eyeballs and adding interactive people, that the network effects would be on his side. I don't think that Zuckerberg understood network effects when he built Facebook. But as soon as it happened back at Harvard, when he saw all the people that went on the girl comparison thing that he did, and then when he began to build Facebook, he saw that that would be the future. And now we go back to this thing about the difference between our space and cyberspace. In our space, we can only make a limited number of connections. I could go out today and meet as many people as I could, and it would still be under 100. But in cyberspace, vis-a-vis this podcast, for example, I can meet tens of thousands of people. And now we're into network effects. And network effects, understanding complexity and leveraging complexity, creates a really different possibility, like the young guy that created Ether and Ethereum monetary transactions, but it's going to be medical records. It's going to be about scientific discoveries. And those leaps of imagination in this other space make all these other things possible. And people that can see that, who are operating that way, have an advantage. That is, people who understand complexity and understand that it has a structure to it can have an advantage.
As we're speaking about complexity, we're going down the uncertain path, speaking about uncertainty. Talk about the individual, though, because we really haven't. We've somewhat gone down that, but we can. You just said, for example,
people will not believe you. They'll think that I fed you that line. That's exactly
because what you were just saying, though. You were talking about complexity for those that understand it. Okay, well, most people probably don't, and so
no. That's why I say that scientific discovery, is an assault on common sense. It's an assault on our this is just like that. In other words, not accepting the given and looking beyond it. Not only looking beyond the given, but looking beyond the given of our education, which is mostly in the complicated. This should cause that. Very few people have education in the nature of complexity. And those that can get it, those that understand it, They have a huge advantage.
But let me keep you there for a second. So the person that's listening that has not had a chance to put in the hours that you have put in, the study that you've put in, what are some ways that, I can think of things like heuristics, but what are some hacks that people can start to think about to take this word complexity, what it represents, and bring it closer to home to where it's not so scary, it's not so frightening, and that you can kind of like wrap your arms around it a little bit more, even though doesn't mean you're going to figure it out, but you can at least have a handle, maybe some technology or an instrument to better deal with it.
Again, I'm going to answer your question by going sideways, but I will answer your question. Is that most of our society is based on what we call negative feedback loops or inhibiting feedback loops, which is to say that we're trying to bring our behavior in line with something. It's like, don't do that. It's like we want to have people do their jobs. In fact, you look at a lot of companies, they're trying to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. This is okay. The thing is, profit is a positive or amplifying feedback loop. Think about that for a moment. Most of business and most of people's activity is trying to bring their behavior in line with something, which is inhibiting to create an amplifying feedback loop. And by the way, an amplifying feedback loop defies perpetual motion machines. Perpetual motion machine being that you've got a machine that can run forever because it never runs out of energy, it doesn't run down. But by definition, an inhibiting feedback loop will run things down. But we want in business something that creates more profit than it costs in energy, which means that it's defying the perpetual motion machine. Okay, that's the frame. How do we do that as humans? How do we create more value than the energy it took to create it? Because to me, that's the underlying question you're asking. The way that that's done is not the way people think it's done. It's not done by carefully planning one's future and carefully creating, I'm going to go to this college and I'm going to do this or that. As we're seeing more and more, it's done based on people creating a number of little experiments in their life, trying things. And then if something works, going, do more of that and do less of what didn't work. Now, that sounds so mundane as to be dismissible. But if you think about it, the number of people that, first of all, starting Bill Gates dropping out of Harvard, the number of people who dropped out of Stanford. Okay, they tried college, and they were also running a Bitcoin mining operation in their dorm room. Or Ken Griffiths was going to college and also trading out of his dorm room. You can look at those and go, oh, well, yeah, he was really ambitious. And, you can also look at it as like it was a number of experiments. People don't think of their lives that way, and it might be useful for them, as you said, a heuristic, a shortcut, to begin to think about that way, is that you don't, in the old traditional adage, you don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Universities don't teach. I'm not going to be too general here, but overall, universities are not looking to the fresh new pups that show up each fall and saying, what you really need to do is experiment. What they're saying to them is what you really need to do is listen to us and just memorize everything, and that's what you're going to do. But you're painting a different picture, Charles.
I am, and I'm also saying, do what they say. If you went to university, if you're going to a university, do what they say as one of the experiments. In other words, that's a possible path. Because,
that's an expensive experiment, huh?
Well, yeah, that's certainly a conversation people are having these days. Is that an experiment worth doing? And I'm saying, if you think about it as one path instead of the path, then maybe people won't want to take those big loans for college. And that might be a good decision. I'm not saying it is or isn't. But I'm saying that the mistake people make is they put all the effort into the planning and the execution of the plan, and that's magical thinking. That plan is going to somehow control reality. Whereas that plan is one of the paths into the future. And that in a complex system with nonlinearities and endogenous effects, and endogenous effects is a fancy word of saying that the world isn't what it was last year or 2 years ago or 10 years ago. And we all know that's true now. And by the way, it didn't used to be that way. The world used to be a pretty stable place. For a long, long time, there was, spring, summer, winter, fall. Do it again.
Do the crops, hunt some, raise some cattle, whatever.
Yeah, right. And now, what worked 10 years ago in the internet is laughed at if you tried to do it now. It's like, well, you're doing that?
I mean, I've let off with this part of it, and I know you're going to circle back, but it gets me back to that point of I'm looking at the wall right now, and I'm imagining an individual there listening to this entire conversation with you. He or she is just saying, I'm scared. I mean, Charles is talking about complexity. Everything's complex. I feel like I don't know where to turn, where to start. How do I navigate complexity? It's a challenge.
Number one, and this is a meta skill. This is the difficulty here. Is in work that I'm not going to go into today, my 5 kinds of minds and levels of mind, is that it turns out that the ability to identify different contexts, the ability to identify what situation am I in, is a high level of thinking, unfortunately, because that's the skill we all need now. It's a simple situation. We're going to get coffee. Done. It's simple. Complicated situation. How do I program this? Predictable, takes time. We can look it up. We can see a video online. We can do it. That's complicated. Complex is, as I said, unpredictable, out of proportion outcomes, unintended consequences. When you're in one of those situations, or something that's fraught with ambiguity, uncertainty, reflexivity, endogenous effects, meaning that it isn't what it was last year. When you're confronted with that last situation and know you're in it, then in that situation, you want to pause, take a breath, and go, okay, in this situation, what I need to do is take small actions and see what effects they have. This I have a whole piece on this. It's like under traditional decision making, you've got your perception. Okay, what situation? You generate options. You evaluate your options, and you take action. This wheel of decision making can be found online in innumerable diagrams. What we actually do is we see a situation, we recognize it, we take action. That's reasoning by resemblance. That's what we actually do most of the time. We don't rationally reason things. In a complex situation, what you want to do is take a small action and see what happens. How does it change the system? And then take another action based on that feedback.
Can I say Bayesian at this point in time?
You can say it, but I don't know if it applies.
Well, I mean, just the idea of updating each step of the way.
Yeah, in that case, a lot of people who use Bayesian are very predictive. I thought you were going the other way. A lot of people use Bayesian as very predictive. But yeah, the idea of updating, which, by the way, also is found in Korzybski and General Semantics from the 20s and 30s. That the girlfriend or boyfriend you met yesterday resembles, but not is exactly the same as the girlfriend or boyfriend you met the day before.
Hey, look, this book, this 5th edition of this book that came out last year that I feature you in, I keep, as you talk in this conversation, I keep, look, I'm a homer here for the subject, but my gosh, it seems like, and maybe this is why we've had a nice relationship for so long, even though you don't specifically write about trend following a lot, just bits and pieces over the course of your career, every time you start going down these paths, I just listen to you and I'm like, my gosh, trend following I need the Charles trend following book, because you give it a completely different take. You give it a completely different take than I do, which is why I've loved to include your work in my books, because it really is this, look, the trend following experiment. Okay. Hey, let's take a trade. We don't know what's going to happen the moment we put the trade on. Okay. It goes a little bit in our favor. Okay. Let's go that way. Ooh, it goes against us. Okay. We got plans for that too. Boom, 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 boom.
Yeah. No. Well, this is something I don't know we have time to get into, that and I have diagrams and so forth on this that I'm really willing to share, is as one goes from the complicated to the complex, there's a phase transition. I'm using the physics term. There's a phase transition. In that phase transition is where things can happen. Take the example of Ray Dalio, who's very popular this year because he published his book about his principles. He takes the point of view, and if you've seen his video, it's a great video, that the markets are essentially a kind of mechanistic system. Complicated, but mechanistic.
Predictable, his perspective.
Right. So he leans into complicated as opposed to complex. With that metaphor, then he has certain strategies which show up in his business, and the whole idea of transparency, radical transparency in his business, and people having to do this and that and the other thing. In other words, what I'm trying to get all the way back to the beginning of our call is that the way people think about the world affects what they do, and which affects the way they think about the world. Ray Dalio, to his credit, because he's made a lot of money, he's done well, thinks the world is at the edge, that phase transition between complicated and complex, and that he can pull it back. He can pull it back to complicated if he can only get control of his people and get them to be radically transparent, all these other things. Ideas have a difference. Ideas have an influence, is my point here. And my point is not merely about Ray Dalio, but every person who's listening, is that your ideas about what reality is about affect your reality as you go forward. Now, to take another example of that, to underline this point, is that George Soros, on the other hand, thinks of economics as being far from equilibrium. I'm using technical terms I'm not taking time to define, but Dalio thinks about economics being closer to equilibrium. That is, that they can come to some balancing point. In other words, when you're doing the numbers, they'll add up at the end. Whereas Soros understands that it's far from equilibrium. That places him in the center of complexity. And hence his strategies are different. He understands that how he and other people think about the markets influences the markets.
And when I'm talking to you, I'm biased because I've put these books out about trend following. I relate more to Nassim Taleb. I look at Soros and his reflexivity, and that's more in a camp where Dalio's in another camp. And it doesn't necessarily mean one's right or wrong. They're just different camps.
That's my point. I was about to go to that. So the first phase transition was between complicated and complex. Second phase transition between complex and chaotic. And there on that phase transition, that is that the markets are at the edge of chaos, which is not exactly what people think it means. There we are with Bogle and yourself, Nassim Taleb. One can make money from the simple thing of Warren Buffett and Munger going, I buy real stuff like railroads, to the phase transition between complicated and complex, where you'll find a Bill Miller or you'll find Ray Dalio, to the phase transition between complex and chaotic, where you'll find trend following and Nassim Taleb's barbell strategy. There are more ways to make money in these markets than people realize, but you got to know where you are in the system and have the perceptions of that point of view to deal with it, and not just be going, ooh, Bitcoin's going up, I think I'll buy some Bitcoin.
Well, I think, hey, listen, I better put a pin in you right there. I've already kept you for much longer. I know people are going to enjoy this, and hopefully, we've not done a fresh one in a long time. I hope you feel energized by doing these again, because look, I know for sure I've seen the listens over my gosh, this podcast started in 2012, so you would have been on in the first year. Listens and listens and listens, lots of them, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands for your episodes. So I hope you would love to come on again over the course of 2018, 19, 20. You sound refreshed, revived. The phoenix has risen, ready to blow all of our minds away all the time, right?
I would like to think so. Yes, I do feel I'm back. And as I say, in this last 5 minutes, we got to the work I'm doing now. It's like there are different possible perspectives in complexity, and you can make money at each of them. And it's a question of understanding that.
Well, we should listen. We should sometime here, maybe even the next month, if you've got some time and we could pick it up right at that point, and we could just, steer the audience along for another journey.
If you'd like, I'm available.
Charles, where can we send everybody to check you out? Charles Faulkner TED Talk will bring up the talk that we've mentioned multiple times today.
It will.
It's very, very easily found. Your website we can send people to?
Which we should remind them doesn't have anything to do with markets, but has to do with how we understand the world.
Yeah. It's really nice. It's very tight. It's very concise, and it's a good supplement, in conjunction with this podcast for sure.
I would say right now, if people will send to me to Faulkner@influentialcommunications.com an email and put in the title this, Covell or trend following or something from this, I will send them a PDF of all of the visuals that we've been talking about, like how I think of complicated, complex, and chaotic, and how I think of the different aspects of complexity. That's available to people if they send that to me.
Faulkner@influentialcommunications.com.
Right, and put in the subject line something about
Covell is a lunatic.
That'll work too.
Charles, thank you very much. Good chatting. Hey, listen, I want to remind everybody, the only person featured in Jack Schwager's Market Wizards books who has come to Saigon to actually hang out with me and refuse to drink the sugarcane drink off the streets of Saigon would be one Mr. Charles Faulkner. I just want to make sure that's clear.
We had a great time, and I look forward to coming back there.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covell.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.